I have described the mitigation of human-induced climate change as a diabolical public policy problem, the most difficult that has come before our polity in living memory. That's how I begin the Garnaut Climate Change Review, which I presented to the Prime Minister on the 29th or the 30th of September last year, the morning of the biggest points fall ever on the New York Stock Exchange after the Congress defeated the Bush proposals, the first set of Bush proposals on responses to the Asian financial crisis. So I presented this product of 18 months' hard work to the Prime Minister, and he mainly wanted to talk to me about Wall Street. So I've done another book since then, The Great Crash of 2008. The climate change policy problem is as diabolical in the United States as Australia, with past abundance and low prices of fossil fuels encouraging exceptionally high per capita emissions of greenhouse gases. Climate change policy has many demanding dimensions, any one of which might make it unlikely that the human species will be up to the challenge. For one, while the average of reputed scientific expectation argues for strong and early action, there is uncertainty around the average. Given humanity's risk aversion in circumstances where variations in outcomes have large consequences, analysis shows that uncertainty strengthens the case for early and strong action. But to the innocent, who are so important in the political process, it makes a case for delay. Second, the costs of mitigation come early and the benefits are long delayed, requiring unaccustomed comparisons of welfare across generations. Third, there are complex income distribution consequences of action and inaction, both domestic and international, which greatly complicate the political economy of policy. Fourth, the combination of complexity, uncertainty, and unusual income distribution effects provides fertile ground for effective intervention by vested interests in the policy-making process at a time when the democratic polities are struggling to maintain a place for the national interest in the big policy contests with vested interests. I think there are parallels between the climate policy debate and the debate about regulation of the financial sector that preceded the Great Crash. With this background, we should be surprised less by the limited extent of progress on the path to the Copenhagen meeting next month than by the substantial nature of recent progress. Not that we're close to an agreement that will reduce the risks of dangerous climate change to what most informed people would think were acceptable, but at least substantial global action looks more likely now than 2 or 3 years ago. Your country and mine, and the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, China, have each changed trajectory over the past couple of years to an extent that brings strong global mitigation within the realms of the possible. I will come back to these 3 national cases after discussing the nature of the international agreement that is required. It has been clear for some time, and obvious since the G20 meeting in Pittsburgh, that we will not get to a satisfactory global treaty in one shot at Copenhagen. What we have to work towards is a framework that allows officials working to heads of government to fill in crucial numbers in the year or so after that. The more detail at Copenhagen, the better, so long as the detail that can be agreed now does not remove stronger options that may enter the sphere of the possible at some later time. There can be no effective mitigation without all countries of substantial size making major contributions to the solution. And yet each country has an interest from a narrow national perspective in doing as little as possible, so long as its own free riding does not undermine the efforts of others. Lagging by some undermines domestic support in others, partly because of resentment at inequitable sharing of the burden, but also because associated distortion of the terms of competition in emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries generate visceral political economy responses. There's a common tendency for people in each country to think that they can free ride on others without that affecting the global outcome, and an even stronger tendency for people in each country to fail to recognise the extent of action in other countries and therefore the extent of their own free riding. The apparent national benefits from free riding make climate change mitigation a more difficult subject of international negotiations than trade. On the 7 or 8 times I've spoken here at the Institute and at the old headquarters in DuPont Circle, I've been talking about trade policy. Well, trade's easy. With trade, unilateral reduction of protection makes a country richer, whatever other countries do. And yet it's hard enough to achieve international agreement on mutual reduction of protection. By contrast, you can't say that going alone with climate change mitigation will make your country better off. The international dimension also makes climate change policy more difficult than other environmental problems, such as removing pollution from the air of large cities or cleaning up degraded rivers. There's a powerful revealed tendency for countries as they get richer to give higher priority to the environmental question, and they fix it up. It's been done in the great cities of America to some extent, Tokyo, most of the cities of developed countries. Well, because the cooperation of all substantial countries is required, we won't fix up climate policy in that way. The problem is made even more difficult by one feature of the history of international discussion of climate change. The international community agreed at the beginning of the international discussions in the early 1990s that the developed countries would make commitments to and implement major actions to reduce their emissions before developing countries would be expected to take these steps. Further, developed countries would be expected to meet the incremental costs of mitigation in developing countries. We all agreed that. There was some justice in this approach, since the countries that are now developed had been responsible for the increase in concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that had taken the world to the threshold of dangerous climate change. It also seemed at that time, in the 90s, that such an approach was consistent with effective climate change mitigation. In the early 90s, developing countries accounted for only about a quarter of global emissions, and there was still thought to be some headroom in concentrations before the thresholds of danger had been crossed. In 2009, the constraints are much tighter. In the early 21st century, the headroom is gone. The Great Crash of 2008 and the Great Recession have led for a while to some reduction in growth in total global emissions, although not to a reduction in emissions themselves in any complete year. The restoration of growth in the large Asian developing countries through 2009 has made that a brief interlude in the growth of global emissions. We have squandered the time and the headroom that we had in the early 1990s. We need to change the trajectory of global emissions urgently if high risks of dangerous climate change are to be avoided. Developing countries now account for over 40% of emissions. The calculations presented in the Garnaut Climate Change Review indicate that, in the absence of mitigation, developing countries will be likely to account for around 90% of the growth in emissions over the 2 crucial decades ahead. The international community's limited progress in the dozen years since Kyoto has been strongly influenced by the failure of 2 developed countries, your country and mine, to ratify the agreement to which they were parties. This history increases the importance of the steps that have been taken in Australia and the United States in recent times. More of that later. It seems unfair to many participants in the discussion that developing countries have to accept major commitments to mitigation with associated constraints on economic growth when the countries that grew rich first knew no such constraints. Unfair or not, there will be no effective global mitigation without participation of developing countries from a date not very far from now. If the differentiated treatment in favour of developing countries, of which the UNFCCC agreements speak, takes the form of long delays in developing countries being required to reduce emissions to well below business as usual, there will be no effective mitigation. An international agreement would need to have the following 5 interlocking elements. There needs to be an agreement on the level of greenhouse gas concentrations that would strike the best balance between economic costs of emissions reduction and risk of damage from climate change. And my report focuses strongly on that choice for one country, Australia. But it turned out that to answer the question for one country, you had to answer it for the world as well, because of the interrelationship between what different countries were doing. The world seems to be heading towards something of an intergovernmental consensus on that. We're heading towards an understanding that concentrations of 450 parts per million, roughly according to the median of the scientific outlooks, about 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature above pre-industrial levels. It's likely that something like that will be agreed in Copenhagen and the period following. The Global Emissions Concentrations Objective defines a global budget for emissions over a specified period, and the second element of an international agreement has to be on how you allocate that budget amongst countries. The agreement has to be based on principles that are widely seen as being fair, and obviously that's easier said than done. It has to seem fair to countries like Australia, the United States and Canada, which sit at the top of the per capita emissions league tables, about twice the per capita emissions of other developed countries, Europe, Japan, New Zealand. And also it has to seem fair to poor developing countries with very low per capita levels. India's per capita emissions, for example, are probably not much more than half of the level that the world will need to get to if we are to maintain concentrations at 450 parts per million. I came to the view in my 18 months of deep immersion in the topic and following a lot of consultations in the main developing countries in Asia that there wasn't going to be any basis for agreement on allocating a budget for emissions entitlements that didn't in the end converge towards equal per capita entitlements. I am still of that view, although there will be widely different views on the period of time over which that convergence should take place. The third element of an agreement is that the agreement needs to be based on entitlements and not on actual emissions. The trade in entitlements allows emissions to be reduced more where they can be reduced more cheaply, and for per capita emissions to be higher where they have higher value, and that can substantially reduce the cost of mitigation in each country and on a global basis. And in addition, the possibility of selling entitlements in countries that do better than their own entitlements, that reduce their emissions below entitlements, can be a powerful incentive for countries to join a strong mitigation effort. And I became particularly aware of that in a series of discussions with the Indonesian cabinet, where this was a crucial issue. The fourth element of an international agreement is that the developed countries need to agree to take the lead in public support for research, development and commercialization of new technologies. And in my report I worked through a model for that, where each of the high-income countries would commit to a certain minimum level of support for research, development and commercialization of the new technologies. I think it would work with each country having a fair bit of freedom to move in choice of priorities and how they do it, so long as the the total commitment to research, development and commercialization is adequate. The cost of making this rapid transition to a low-carbon economy is going to be seriously lower if there is adequate support for innovation. And the fifth element of an agreement, and one that's going to be necessary to get many developing countries on board, recognises the inevitability of substantial costs of climate change, because we're too late, because there will be substantial costs even given the best possible outcome for mitigation. And poor developing countries don't have the institutions, the financial capacity to fund adaptation, so that the fifth element of an international agreement is going to need to be increases in development assistance to low-income developing countries to assist in the adaptation to inevitable climate change. On the allocation of the global mitigation entitlements budget, I ended up focusing on convergence towards equal per capita entitlements in 2050 within a framework of contraction and convergence, which is fairly well known in the international discussion. You start from current per capita levels and you converge towards equal per capita levels, lower average levels at a date in the future. And I did all of my calculations around that convergence date being 2050. The model didn't work for the rapidly growing developing countries, which would have found it impossible to live within those convergence lines. And so as an alternative in a transition period in the early years, probably up to 2020, I allowed for emissions to grow in the rapidly growing developing countries at half the rate of growth of GDP. Convergence towards equal per capita entitlements increases appropriately the adjustment burden on countries with the highest per capita emissions at the beginning, especially Australia, Canada and the United States amongst developed countries. It reduces the absolute reductions in emissions required in countries with relatively high population growth. As it happens, also Australia, Canada and the United States, the three outstanding countries of immigration. The tendency for these two considerations to work in opposite directions reduces the range of percentage reductions in total emissions across developed countries. The approach to allocation of a 2013 to 2020 global budget adopted in my review was built on one-sided targets for developing countries. There was no getting away easily from the history of discussions which excluded developing countries from binding commitments initially. And so I suggested one-sided targets where a developing country could only benefit from a range of welfare-raising possibilities, including sale of emissions permits, participation in adaptation expenditures, participation in absorption of new technologies funded under the low emissions technology commitment, if it was committing voluntarily to the binding emissions targets. But in the case of China, there had to be an exception. The arithmetic didn't add up unless China was bound by its commitments from the beginning. China was simply such a large part of the global story. The proposed allocations for developing countries required reductions of about 10% from what could have been expected under business as usual, and business as usual embodied the sort of reduction in energy intensity of output that could be expected under normal development scenarios. The realization of an ambitious global mitigation target, 450 parts per million, would require much tighter constraints from 2020 to 2050 on both developed and developing countries. the world would need to reduce total emissions from 2000 levels by 50% in 2050. Obviously, much more from developed than from developing countries. The review embodied a rigorous approach to achievement of specified emissions concentrations. The numbers proposed added up to the required concentrations. This meant that to achieve the 450 parts per million target, if one country committed to less, others would have to commit to correspondingly more. There's been much international discussion of my review's proposed basis for allocating entitlements. In developing countries, the main comment has been that 2050 is too long to wait for convergence, and the Development Research Center of the State Council in China published a paper to that effect in a book that Li Gangsong, who's here today, and I edited last year. This is the discussion the world has to have, discussions of alternative ways of dividing up a global emissions budget that add up to avoidance of high risks of dangerous climate change. Well, how do commitments leading up to Copenhagen line up against what is necessary for a 450 parts per million concentrations outcome? The answer is surprising in the light of popular discussion in the United States and Australia and in much of the world. There is a deal to be done within what is politically feasible in the major countries, although we've still got a fair way to go. My review's allocations propose that Australia's proportionate contribution to an effective global agreement to achieve an ambitious international agreement will be to reduce emissions entitlements by 25% from 2000 levels by 2020 and by 90% by 2050. The Rudd government accepted the recommended target for 2020, conditional on corresponding commitments being made by other developed countries and major developing countries making commitments to hold emissions below business as usual. The European Union's conditional commitments to reduce emissions by 30% is in line with the proposals in my review. The new Japanese government has offered to reduce emissions by 25% in the context of an effective global agreement. This is substantial, though it falls short of assessed requirements as part of the global deal that I defined. It is the extent of proposed commitments from the large developing countries that holds out the possibility of the numbers holding up for ambitious mitigation, and the recent discussion in Indonesia, Brazil, and most importantly China is reasonably encouraging in this respect. Well, let's look at recent developments in three countries: Australia, the United States, and China. Australia has been going through a dramatic legislative process on climate change mitigation that is still incomplete, but which has divided and greatly damaged the Conservative parties in opposition, and seems to leave the best cards with the government committed to Australia playing its proportionate part in a strong global effort. Australian governments in the 90s of both political persuasions were full participants in the international discussion of climate change mitigation, and the Howard government, like the Clinton government, was a full party to the Kyoto Agreement in 1997, and at the time there was no suggestion that Australia would not go on to ratify the treaty. An election in the United States led to a change in Australian policy. And Australia joined the Bush administration in a policy of not ratifying Kyoto from early 2001. The Howard and Bush administration stood shoulder to shoulder against international cooperation on reduction of emissions until they had to respond to a groundswell of community interest in action late in the second Bush term. In Australia, the Labor opposition, politically stronger under the new leadership of Kevin Rudd from late 2006, began to make ground with a critique of the government's refusal to ratify the Kyoto Treaty. State governments began to design an emission trading scheme for implementation in the absence of a national scheme. The Howard government eventually felt it had to respond and established a joint government industry task force, with industry being represented mainly by the high emissions industries, to make recommendations on the introduction of an emission trading scheme. That task force report was available in May of 2007, and it paved the way for an announcement by the Howard government that it would, if re-elected, introduce an emissions trading scheme in 2011 or at the latest 2012. I presented my review to the Prime Minister and State Premiers on September the 30th, or September the 29th, September the 30th, 2009. The Rudd government, elected in November 2007, accepted my recommendations both on an unconditional target of -5% on 2000 levels by 2020 and a conditional target up to -25%. The government, as it turned out, has offered rather more assistance to emissions-intensive industries than could be justified on grounds of economic efficiency or equity, keeping for auctioning about half of the total permits. The government introduced legislation for the emissions trading scheme in mid-2009. It soon passed the House of Representatives, in which the government has a secure majority, but not the Senate. It was opposed in the Senate by both the Conservative opposition parties, which accepted the targets but insisted on even more assistance to emissions-intensive industries, and by the Australian Greens, which wanted more demanding targets, conditional targets of -40%. Only the Conservative opposition could deliver the numbers for Senate passage, and the government entered negotiations and eventually agreement with the opposition leadership on amendments. This agreement increased the economic cost of the scheme by extending further support for emissions-intensive industry and permanently exempting agriculture. Australian political parties are highly disciplined, so that the next developments were unusual. Indeed, what came next has no parallel in Australian politics over the past half-century. The government reached agreement with the major opposition party on November the 22nd, last week. On the 23rd of November, an opposition party room discussion of the agreement broke down in rancour, leading quickly to a challenge to the party leadership. Tuesday morning, 1st of December, that's today, but yesterday evening Washington time, the opposition opted by a single vote to switch leaders from Malcolm Turnbull, who supported the government's amended legislation, to Tony Abbott, who was committed to defeating it. Abbott continues to support the targets, but is against the means of reaching them. It was still possible that a split in the opposition in the Senate would allow passage of the legislation. In any case, the government is in a strong position to secure its objectives after a likely victory at a new election for the House of Representatives and the half or the whole of the Senate. The Australian Constitution has a mechanism for resolving legislative deadlock between the two houses, involving a full election of the Senate along with the House of Representatives, with any legislation that had fallen foul of the deadlock between the houses coming before a joint sitting of the two houses after the election. So that option is available to the Prime Minister, and his political position at the moment is incomparably strong if he wishes to use it. The past week has also seen major developments on climate change policy in the United States and China, although while more important than in Australia, rather less dramatic than in Australia. The Obama government's commitment last week to reduce emissions from 2005 levels by around 17% by 2020 and 83% by 2050 is historic and problematic. It places the President's full weight behind the proposals that have been through the House, and therefore, I presume, increases the chances of acceptance. It's problematic for two reasons. The rest of the world had to stand and watch the fate of the League of Nations and the Kyoto Protocol, and we will stand and watch again. And it's also problematic because it doesn't go far enough for the United States to make a proportionate contribution to a global effort towards achieving concentrations of 450 parts per million, especially for 2020. Given where the United States debate has been and is at in November 2009, It looks to a foreigner as if the 2020 target is as good as is possible before Copenhagen from a government that wants to go as far as is possible. More might be possible a year hence, and I myself think that the prospects of a strong global outcome will be enhanced by confining the Copenhagen outcome to articulation of principles, with final agreement on numbers being left until more is feasible. That may yet be the judgment of leaders at Copenhagen, but that approach, of course, would run the risk of worse US outcomes a year or so hence. As my review observes, there are many combinations of national commitments that add up to a particular global emissions concentrations. A goal of 450 parts per million can be reached despite one country doing less, so long as other countries do more. The good news is that there are signs that a number of the major developing countries may do more. China's commitment to reduce 2020 emissions intensity of output to 40 to 45% below 2005 levels goes well beyond my proposals and well beyond what at the time I thought was likely. Chinese leaders have referred to their commitments as being binding domestically. They will have to be binding internationally for them to do their job in the international discussions. Focused mitigation and the shifting of the emissions trajectory starts earlier than under my proposals. I presume that changes in trajectory in major developing countries wouldn't occur until the beginning of the post-Kyoto period. China has started them now. And if you calculate the departure from business as usual from what China has put on the table, it amounts to about 25% for a 40% reduction in emissions intensity and about 30% for a 45% reduction. These can be compared with the review's arithmetic, which relied on a 10% reduction below business as usual. There's been some negative commentary on the Chinese commitment. It is said that it does not go beyond what China has been doing anyway, and that it's only a commitment to reduce the emissions intensity of production and not emissions themselves. China's made a great deal of progress over the past 2 years, and especially over the past year. It has had a domestic goal of reducing the energy intensity, not emissions intensity, in the current 5-year plan period 2006 to 2010, but it didn't make ground on that in the first couple of years. It's made a lot of ground in 2007, or from late 2007 until now, the last 2 years. Reductions in energy intensity were supported by commitments to increase the renewable share of energy supply to 15% in 2020. Again, over the last year or so, there's been a big increase in momentum in growth of low emission sources of energy, and there's talk of strengthening those targets. Last week's announcement breaks new ground because it is framed in terms of reducing emissions intensity and not energy intensity. And for the first time it announces as firm policy the continuation of strong objectives for reducing emissions intensity to 2020. The old commitments only went to 2010. But even if this were not the case, I think it would be counterproductive to exclude from the value of commitments towards an international agreement any measures that have been developed independently of the negotiations. That would discourage progress outside negotiations. It would lead us into the unproductive trade negotiation syndrome, in which trade liberalisation at home is held back as bargaining coin in negotiations. The recent announcements should be seen as China extending its domestic commitments and taking them forward in time. There's been a dramatic change in the tone of domestic Chinese discussion of mitigation policies over the past 2 years, and especially over the past year, and reductions in emissions is now an integral part of the whole economic policy discussion. That's a new thing. That's a new thing of the past year. And I think there is growing confidence in China that it really can make strong ground in reducing emissions, and it's that growing confidence as much as the international discussion that's led to the statement by the Chinese government last week. Continued growth in confidence will make more ambitious commitments possible over time. To express disappointment that the Chinese commitment takes the form of reductions in emissions intensity rather than absolute reductions is to profess ignorance of the whole framework of international discussion so far. It's only now that the question of developing countries accepting binding constraints has been put on the table, that in the formal negotiations. That's a weakness of the discussion so far, but it's part of the history that we've got to grow out of. China's November 2009 announcement makes it more likely that other large developing countries, including Indonesia, Brazil and South Africa, and with greater difficulty in smaller prospects India, will go further towards firm commitments. And when you look at the detail of what's happening in Indonesia and Brazil, South Africa with its carbon tax, there's certainly substantial things being discussed which are missed in most of the developed country discussion of mitigation in developing countries. The chances of a strong outcome at Copenhagen and its aftermath will be enhanced if other countries accepted that the recent US announcement is the best that is possible at this time, and think in terms of other countries covering the shortfall. That's a weaker commitment than any of the other developed countries have accepted, but I think it would be a bad outcome if other developed countries started seeing the US commitments as the standard rather than staying where they are and accepting that it nevertheless is a substantial commitment from the United States and a big departure from historical positions. Well, to conclude, I'd just like to point to a dark side to what has been a fairly positive discussion of recent changes in trajectory. The approaches being adopted to emissions reduction policy in developed countries are likely to be unnecessarily expensive and corrosive, both to open international trade and to fiscal recovery from the great crash of 2008. The standard studies of the costs and benefits of climate change mitigation, either for the world as a whole, like the Stern review in 2007, or for a single country, my review in 2008, presume the presence of an efficient system of policy to support the transition to a low-emission economy. An efficient system would have two essential elements. It would include an appropriate price on emissions to correct the externality associated with emissions themselves, imposed either as a tax on emissions or through an emissions trading system, with similar prices in all countries. The similar price could be achieved by agreement or generated by trade in emissions entitlements. International trade in emissions entitlements or tax credits would allow emission reductions to occur where they could be achieved at lowest economic cost. An efficient system would include public support for research, development and commercialization of new low emissions technology to correct the externality associated with innovation. The price on emissions would generate large amounts of revenue, large enough to cover the costs of support for innovation, and in addition to make a major contribution to the reduction of fiscal imbalances in the aftermath of the Great Crash and the Great Recession. The pricing of emissions, whether through a tax or a trading system, uses the economic system's taxation capacity, whether the potential revenue is given to big emitters as free permits or tax exemptions, or collected by government. If it is given to emitters, it absorbs taxation capacity without contributing to the revenue, and so adds to the difficulty of fiscal consolidation. Optimal policies cannot be taken for granted. Shortfalls from optimality could have great costs for the economy. The current signs are not good. Governments through the developed countries are developing emissions trading systems that give back to large emitters a high proportion of the rent value of the scarcity of entitlements. I mentioned in Australia the ratio is about half. This has encouraged rent-seeking investment in the political process that in Australia has been unknown since the high tide of protection of domestic industry before the trade liberalisation of a generation ago. In the case of domestic electricity generation, the free permits are generally given out in mistaken belief, encouraged by the generators, that this will reduce the price impact on consumers. In practice, the scarcity value of permits will be passed through to consumers, whether or not generators have been given free permits. The allocation of free permits to trade-exposed emission-intensive industries is quantitatively more important. In every country, the free permits are a response to perceptions that other countries are imposing lower mitigation costs on their industries than the home country. The effects of many countries taking this approach are to exempt the most emissions-intensive industries from the disciplines of emissions pricing, and therefore placing a much greater adjustment burden on the rest of the economy, to utilise economy's taxation capacity without corresponding benefit to the public revenue, and thoroughly to distort international trade in emissions-intensive products. The argument for exemption from a carbon tax or for issue of free permits to trade-exposed industries on the grounds that other countries are doing less than one's own is used much more widely than can be justified by the objective circumstances. All pressures for relocation of industry as a result of emissions pricing are attributed to differential emissions pricing when, of course, even if all countries had similar emissions prices, there would be pressure for environmentally and economically efficient relocation of industry. If you seek to avoid that, then you're seeking to avoid the whole purpose of the emissions trading scheme or the carbon tax. Overcompensation for carbon leakage in one country invariably stimulates claims for greater compensation in others, and we had a nice or awful example of this in late September, where New Zealand quite explicitly raised the numbers of free permits it was giving its trade-exposed industries because it said Australia had recently changed its scheme to give away more. Differences in government's approaches to assistance to trade-exposed industries are likely to become more important to a firm's competitiveness in the international market for an emissions-intensive product than typical inter-firm differences in the efficiency with which resources are used. It's potentially hugely distorting for the global trading system. And this comes at a time when we've got good reason to be worried about other distortions in the global trading system. Jagdish Bhagwati's recent book, The Termites in the System, analyses the breakdown of commitment to multilateral open trade. That's one of the distortions that we have to contend with. An even bigger one in the aftermath of the Great Crash is the huge subsidies to some trade-exposed industries, for an example financial services and automobiles. In those two big sectors, one can say that the amount of support your government gives you is the key determinant of competitiveness these days, much more so than how good you are at making financial services or cars. So with the mitigation policies and assistance to trade-exposed industries, we've got a third very large challenge to open multilateral trade. In my review, I discussed ways to address this problem at some length, and there are long-term as well as transitional solutions to these trade problems. The long-term solution is to have binding caps in all significant countries, all substantial countries, and to have opportunities for trade and entitlement, so you end up with similar prices for carbon and other greenhouse gases in all countries. That removes the case for subsidy of trade-exposed industry in any case, and we all should be designing our schemes so that all that support, all those free permits to trade-exposed industries comes off as soon as we've got that international regime in place. The difference that could make to our budgets is transformative. But we're not going to get to that position quickly, and we need some transitional arrangement other than the arbitrary processes of handing out billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies through political processes, which is going on right now. I've suggested an approach in the review that looks subjectively at the difference in product prices that results from other countries subsidies being less than one's own. It would be better if such an arrangement were managed through an international mechanism, and the WTO is the obvious one. I've discussed this with Pascal Lamy. We would need to have discussions leading to voluntary codes rather than mandatory arrangements, but it could be done if a number of WTO members were interested in having that done. It's certainly no solution for countries with ambitious emissions reduction schemes to adopt countervailing restrictions on trade, as you've got in your congressional bills, as the European Union has in its proposed post-Kyoto schemes. We don't have them in ours, principally because we know we'd be victims rather than predators in such a game of countervailing restrictions on trade. Neither do the established processes of the WTO provide a solution. It's probably illegal under the WTO Subsidies Code to provide free permits in the form favoured in many countries' emissions trading schemes. Action through the established WTO processes requires the crystallisation of a dispute with dangers of descent into endless litigation, surrounded by rising international tensions over trade measures. Most developed countries in any case would prefer to let sleeping dogs lie in relation to others' arrangements, so as not to encourage interest in their own. And Gary Hufbauer here at the Institute has written some very sensible things about that. Finally, I see risks in the way we're headed on implementation of emissions trading schemes to the prospects of fiscal consolidation, restoring macroeconomic stability in the aftermath of the Great Crash. And the background here is that the budget problems of all developed countries are truly daunting, of truly historic proportions. And here the concern is that free allocation of permits is dissipating a considerable amount of taxation capacity at a time when all developed countries are facing these budgetary problems. The taxable capacity is used whether the revenue is collected and goes into consolidated revenue or whether it's given back as free permits to emissions. The dissipation of this potential support for fiscal consolidation is a major threat to sustained recovery from the Great Crash of 2008. One country alone could limit the unnecessary drain on fiscal capacity by adopting optimal approaches to transitional assistance for trade-exposed industries along the lines I suggested, or all major countries together could remove completely this drag on recovery from crisis through early movement towards caps on emissions in all substantial countries, accompanied by trade in emissions entitlements, and using that as the trigger for us all to withdraw from these damaging and huge subsidies. Thanks.